Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to talk about something that's a bit different from the presentations you've had so far. As it says there, I'm talking about psychological well-being. I'm not directly talking about safety behavior as such. Psychological well-being is something that has implications as far as individuals' health in particular is concerned, and also their performance in the workplace. I think the difference between what we've talked about so far mostly is that we've looked at things that are observable accidents and their consequences. For psychological well-being, of course, the damage it does, or the protection it provides, is A, invisible. You can't observe it directly, and B, it's slow in terms of having its effect. It takes time, it takes years, it takes decades in some cases. One direct connection, of course, is between stress and safety behavior. But what I hope to show is that there's a lot more to thinking about psychological well-being in the workplace than just that fairly predictable and obvious suggestion. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Why is psychological well-being important both for individuals and for the organizations that they work within? I'll talk about the causes or the workplace drivers of well-being and identify some key workplace factors that are really important. And then I'll say something very briefly about the kinds of solutions or interventions that can take place in the workplace to improve psychological well-being. Okay, so why does it matter? Well, my proposition, and what comes from the research of the last 10 years or so, is it matters to every one of us in this room. Low levels of psychological well-being have consequences, and there's a great deal of research that's built up, particularly over the last decade or so, linking poor levels of psychological well-being with these kind of outcomes. There's a well-established risk in terms of the relationship between psychological well-being and cardiovascular problems of various kinds. There's also a link between weight and diabetes. It's actually because the hormones that are released when people's psychological well-being is low or when they're under stress have an impact on the regulation of glucose. They have an impact on the parts of the endocrine system that produce insulin. So there's a risk of diabetes and weight-related problems. And there's also a problem for people's immune systems. One of the things that happens when we're under stress is that we prepare to deal with that. And the cortisol, which probably most people have heard of, is usually referred to as the stress hormone. Cortisol and other kinds of hormones are released. And they have an impact trying to shut down things that are unnecessary if we're going to respond to a threat. And one of the things that they shut down is parts of the immune system, which is fine in the short term, but in the longer term, if you stay at that elevated level of poor psychological well-being and high levels of stress, it begins to create physical health problems of the kind that I've identified here. This is not just me saying it. There's a really strong, as I've said, evidence base. 40 or so longitudinal studies, many of them linking psychological well-being factors with the kinds of outcomes that I've just been talking about. Probably the one that's not quite established fully yet is the link with cancer. There is some research showing links between poor levels of psychological health and cancer. These are mostly predictive, prospective studies, so you can tell something about the cause and effect and which way round, because obviously people who are ill are not necessarily going to be in the best place when it comes to their psychological health. But because they're prospective, predictive studies, we know that it's the poor psychological well-being that comes first, and then the physical ill health that follows. I don't want to leave you with the impression, though, that there's only a link between psychological well-being and serious illnesses. This is one of a number of studies actually done by this research team, Sheldon Cohen and his colleagues. And it's at the other end of the spectrum. It's relatively minor illness, it's the common cold. And what they did in what's referred to as a fully randomized control study, double-blind, is they infected people with the common cold, but the people who were being infected didn't know who was being infected. Neither did the investigators, so they were blind to who was being infected as well. They took follow-up measures to check and see whether they got colds or not. And again, they didn't just ask people whether they had a cold, they actually got them to produce mucus, how much mucus they produced. They collected it. It's a bit gory. They collected it, they weighed it, and they could tell who had a cold and who didn't. But what's interesting, just look at the difference. The low well-being group is the one on the right in the darker blue, and the high well-being is the one on the left. Almost twice as many in the low well-being group collected a cold. And again, you know, that's not one isolated study, it's one of many, and there are all sorts of similar studies going on around the world. And we're beginning to understand, as I mentioned earlier on, the underlying psychobiological mechanisms that work here that connect these things together. So that's my first point. Psychological well-being, when it's high, has a protective effect for individuals, and it has a damaging effect, particularly long-term, if it's low for individuals. What I haven't done is said, actually, what do I mean by psychological well-being? Well, it's got two components. The top refers to the affective or the emotional component. That's about feeling good, feeling happy, if you like. It's sometimes referred to as hedonic well-being, hedonism, the Greek pursuit of pleasure and happiness in its own right. But there's another component to full psychological well-being as well, which turns out to be really important in the workplace. Let me just illustrate that. So imagine that you're sitting on a boat in the Mediterranean. You've got your feet up, sun shining, got something nice to drink at hand, good company. How many people could handle that for a day or two? Yeah, okay. A week? A month? 6 months? Eventually, everybody shakes their head and says, no, 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 too long. Why? Why? Because there's no meaning and purpose to it. You can't get any sense of achievement. There's nothing that makes it seem really worthwhile. And those are the two components. The second one is often referred to as eudaimonic. Eudaimonic's another Greek term, and it refers to the life well lived, basically. So when I talk about psychological health and well-being, I've got two components to it. One is positive emotionality, and the second is a sense of purpose and meaning in terms of what people are doing in the workplace, if we're focused on the workplace in particular, which we are. You know, there's a trend line that shows the importance for organizations as well as individuals. And that's my next point, that high levels of psychological well-being is not just beneficial for the individual, it's actually beneficial for the organization. So we've got a win-win situation here. That data's from, that we've collected 39,000 people across 27 different organizations over the last 5 years. And you can see a very clear trend line showing link between productivity and the people's experience of positive emotions, basically, is the bottom axis. I have to say, when I show trend lines, I am always quite suspicious of trend lines that point to the future and will go, you know, there's the trend, and in another year it will be like this, and another year it will be like this. And it reminds me of a thing I saw a couple of years ago, which was that, and this is in the UK, according to the statistics and the rate of growth of Elvis Presley impersonators, I'm quite a fan of Elvis Presley, by the way, according to the rate of growth of Elvis Presley impersonators, 2 out of every 3 people in the UK will be Elvis Presley impersonators by the year 2020. So if you have colleagues who are Brits or visitors, then just take a look in their suitcase, see if the white suit with the sequins on is there, because it's going to happen according to the trend. Okay, benefits to the organization. Just like the individual side of things, on the organizational side of things, there's a growth in the number of really good research studies that are showing us the benefit of high levels of psychological well-being. I know that's a busy slide, but take a look at the words in red. They're the critical ones. They were the dependent variables in the studies, and what the investigators have done, sometimes, or in 3 cases, the bottom two studies there are meta-analysis studies. In other words, they pulled together the results from many, many individual studies and aggregated them. So you've got tens of thousands of cases of data over large numbers of organizations. And what these studies all consistently point to is that there's a strong relationship between the level of psychological well-being of employees in the business unit and a whole range of performance factors. And again, I could have used a lot more examples of studies here. I've just picked out some to illustrate the point that I'm talking about something with an evidence base. That's becoming clearer and clearer. And again, just like with the individual side of things, one of the things that I'm interested in, and so are other people who are interested in this area, is, well, okay, what's the mechanism? Why is it that when psychological well-being is high, you get these kind of outcomes? I think this is the kind of thing that's responsible for a lot of it. All of these bullet points are things that, again, are research-based from studies which show the difference between people who are high or low on psychological well-being. And I think what you can see is a range of behaviors there. I didn't mention safety behavior on the earlier slide, but you can see from the kind of things that are covered on this slide the difference in behavior that you'd get from people who are high or low on psychological well-being. And I think that's what connects, that's what supports the findings, that there are connections between high levels of psychological well-being and good performance because people behave differently when their psychological well-being is high. And they behave differently in those kind of ways. Which chief executive would look at that list and say, no, I don't want people who behave like that. I don't want people who've got those kind of strengths. Not many, I don't think. Okay, so what about the things in the workplace that are important for determining levels of psychological well-being? Again, it's a strong research base, and there's a fairly clear and consistent set of findings. The first thing that has an impact on people's level of psychological well-being is the work demands that are made on them, either cognitive, physical, emotional, whatever they are. But the thing I want to make really clear now is that low demand is not psychologically healthy. High demand is healthy because it provides people with an opportunity to achieve. And to go back to the point about meaning and purpose, how can you have a strong sense of achievement when the task you've been trying to complete hasn't been particularly challenging? When do you feel at your best in the workplace? It's not when you're sitting with your feet up, doing nothing. For most people, it's when you've just achieved something that was challenging and that was really important to you. And so I think demands make a difference. And of course, if they get too extreme, or worse still, ambiguous and confusing, so people actually can't tell how and when they're doing a good job, then demands start to create problems. What helps to soften the impact of demands that might be unreasonable is giving people a level of control about how they go about the work and providing them with support. That might be emotional support, the kind of thing that Ben was talking about earlier, but it might also be support in terms of resources, communications, equipment, etc. Anything that supports them in meeting the demands of the job. So everything's always a balance between the right level of demand, the right level of support, the right level of control, allowing people to do things in their own way. And I think there's an interesting dilemma for the safety area there. The research I know about shows very clearly that the more control and discretion you give to people, the happier they are in their work, in general. But of course, with some safety aspects, you can't give over that much control, or it's dangerous to do so. So there's an interesting little conflict there. The final area is the one I've already talked about, which is enabling people to have a sense of achievement and experience something positive from doing their work. So those are the core factors. I haven't got time now to break those down in a bit more detail, but there's a very, very clear message from research, from case studies, and from interventions that demands, control, support, and the way that they're combined are the key factors in determining people's psychological health at work on an ongoing basis. And these are the same factors that drive a whole range of things. They drive well-being, they drive absence, they drive presenteeism, and they probably drive safety behavior too. Okay, so if you want to do something in an organization to, as best you can, enhance people's levels of psychological well-being, and do bear in mind here that I'm not just talking about making sure that people don't get stressed. I'm talking about everybody in the organization, and I'm talking about elevating everybody's level of psychological well-being, and that will pay off for them and for the organization. So it's not just about dealing with the tip of the iceberg and dealing with stress. There are lots of interventions that you can do. I've picked 3 fairly popular ones, and I'm very quickly just going to run over what they might be. First one is about managing the job pressures effectively. Second is about building resilience. And the third is about encouraging healthy behaviors, in particular exercise. Managers and leaders, we've heard lots about managers and leaders earlier on today. My message is fundamentally the same. Managers and leaders have a big impact on people's psychological well-being and health. One of the quotes that I really like in relation to that and the area I'm talking about is when you look back at somebody who's been your manager or your leader, you may not remember what they said, but you will definitely remember how they made you feel. And I think what that shows is the power that managers have to indirectly or directly impact on people's psychological well-being at work. This, for me, is one of the most important things in that particular area as well. Refer to this as the pressure performance curve. If you turn up pressure on the horizontal axis, what you find is people's performance increases. When there's too little pressure, and I must separate pressure and stress. Pressure and demands are healthy and good. Stress is not. It's when the pressure or demands on people, when they feel that they exceed their ability to cope. So pressure and demands are positive and good, enabling people to feel a sense of achievement. Stress, when it gets to be too much, is not. And as you can see from that curve, what happens ideally in the role of a manager or leader is to turn the pressure up to the point where people feel challenged and they're working at an optimum level and they're motivated and well, but not so far that they end up sliding down the other side of that curve into the danger zone. I talked about, or I mentioned, building resilience as another option that helps as an intervention to build psychological health and well-being in the workplace. The the last 5 to 10 years, probably 5 years in the workplace, has seen a real growth in people's interest in building the resilience of employees. This is how I see resilience, that it has two components, basically. One is the psychological component that retains people's psychology. It enables people to feel psychologically healthy. And the second is the behavioral one, and this is the one that's important for the workplace itself. It enables people to focus on what they should be doing well, even though they're coping with pressure and adversity of kinds that might knock them off track. So that's what being resilient means. And people are resilient more or less in different situations. Some people can work really well in a situation where they have very little control. Some people find it very difficult and challenging when they don't have enough control. Some people work really well in situations where there are very high demands and relatively little support. Some people can't. So there are individual profiles. It's a combination of what the individual prefers and the demands that are being made on them. And the second point is that resilience is developable. It's not fixed. It's influenced by our underlying personality factors in terms of our natural levels of resilience, but you can teach resilience. And for example, we do quite a lot of that over a couple of days with another follow-up, or maybe longer courses, or sometimes even shorter ones. Finally, I just mentioned physical activity. I'll just explain the slide first and then make a more general point. So this is about people's propensity to experience stress when placed in stressful situations or situations where they're coping with adversity. The odds ratio on the right-hand side there is a thing that epidemiologists use to indicate whether something makes a difference or not. And basically, if you take the top line, sedentary behavior, in other words, people who don't do any exercise, that's set at 1. The improvement, moderate exercise, goes down to 0.42. You can read that as an improvement of about 60%. So that's how to indicate the improvement, which is quite a significant change. Now, I'm not particularly advocating jogging here. It just so happens that that came out in that particular study. The important thing is that moderate levels of exercise is the critical thing. And I'm not talking about the influence it has on your heart or your cardiovascular system or your physical well-being. I'm talking about the influence it has on your psychological health and well-being directly. I attended a workshop in New York a couple of years ago, and it was populated with researchers in the field, mostly people who worked in laboratories looking at psychological well-being and various aspects. And everybody had 15 minutes to present their own research. And then the second day, there was a discussion about, okay, what does this all mean? As we were getting through the second day, probably the most distinguished person in the room who's done most of the research, really groundbreaking research here, stood up and said, do you know, I think that in terms of people maintaining their psychological health and well-being, there might be something that's quite close to a magic bullet. And that magic bullet is exercise and moderate levels of exercise. It doesn't have to be running or jogging, digging the garden, housework, all sorts of things contribute. Fast walking is fine as well. A couple of final points before I close. One is that I suppose, inevitably, while I've been talking, I've focused on the negative impact of low levels of psychological well-being. And I want to just come back to where the interesting research is going on at the moment, which is to show that if you can build psychological well-being for the individual, it has a significant protective effect for the individual. So higher levels of positive psychological well-being exert this kind of protection. And it's really significant. For example, that difference, high versus low psychological well-being of 2 standard deviations. Well, 2 standard deviations, if you think of it in percentile terms, takes you from somewhere around about the 20th percentile to somewhere around about the 80th percentile. So it's a massive shift in terms of where you fall in the population. These effects are the equivalent of the effects of other well-established risk factors, such as diet, smoking, and other lifestyle factors. They really do matter, and they are significant. We're talking about levels of psychological well-being over time. And then, of course, we've got the impact on behavior, health-related behavior, work-related behavior. I just want to finish off. I've spent a lot of the last 15 years or so trying to help organizations to first understand how you can approach the psychological health and well-being of a whole workforce. Because it's very different from physical health or many aspects of safety. Most people have a model, for instance, with physical health. We want to improve the physical health of our workforce. Okay, great. We'll get some exercise going. We'll do something about their diet. We'll try and look at their shift patterns and work patterns and their rotation patterns and so on and so on. And it's relatively easy to look at the kind of things that not necessarily easy to do something about it, but everybody has a model of what to do. When you ask that question about psychological well-being, often I think people's take on that is not very clear. And providing a model that enables people to think about psychological health and well-being is the kind of thing that we've been doing over the last 10 or 15 years. These are some of the things that have just reflections on doing that work. First one is that there are many people in organizations who actually just don't get it. And one of the reasons why, what I mean by don't get it, is they don't see the importance of psychological well-being. And I would be very surprised if some of you in the audience weren't thinking exactly that, despite what I think of as a lot of evidence that I've presented. People don't get it because they are naturally resilient, they've risen to a good level in organizations, and they don't feel the psychological pressure in the way that others do. And so they look at the whole field, and they really just do not understand. But don't forget, psychological resilience and competency to do a job are not necessarily the same thing. So you can have some very good people who might need a little bit of support or help. Second point is that the words you use in this area are hugely important. For example, if you talk about resilience, in some organizations that's fine. In others, the reaction is, oh yeah, resilience is about being able to cope with adversity. So you're going to boost my resilience. Why? What kind of adversity do you have around the corner that I'm going to have to cope with? So people change the terminology. They use things like vitality, all sorts of different terms. But the words used and the way it's introduced, best approach is to get the words from the workforce and then play it back to them, rather than going in with some preconceived set of concepts. One final aside before I do finish. That terminology issue reminds me of something I saw in the newspaper a couple of years ago. Is everybody familiar with the term that we use in English to bottle something up, or to bottle up? So, you know, if you can imagine, this actually was a newspaper report of something going on in Afghanistan. It was an Al-Qaeda group, and they'd been bottled up by a section of the British Army. And a newspaper columnist wrote about this, and the headline was, and it's just an example of how the words can actually suddenly take on a different meaning, and it was, British Army push bottles up Al-Qaeda. Now, I don't know whether pushing bottles up people or shooting them is worse or better, but it wasn't what the journalist intended. One of the things that people don't do, and I do recognize that this is a thing that happens in the safety field in particular, is that joining up the interests of people who are interested in health and well-being is quite rare in organizations. There are people who are responsible for talent management. Now, one of the things that is happening in more and more is that people are using evidence of high levels of psychological well-being in their organization, best companies to work for and things like that, and using that to attract talent. Most organizations, it's something like occupational health or welfare who are interested in psychological health and well-being, and they don't very often work particularly closely, say, with talent management or with HR. So having a strategic joined-up approach is actually quite rare, but it's by far the best way to actually pay dividends in this area. Interventions, I've mentioned a few, but I would say don't simply just go, right, okay, let's do some resilience training, without collecting the evidence to see which type of intervention or which type of solution might be most appropriate for which unit of the organization, because it's very rare that applying one intervention across a whole organization is actually going to work effectively. And the final point, and this is something that I've been trying to persuade people of for a long time, there's still a feeling amongst quite senior people in lots of organizations, despite the fact that you can put loads of evidence on the table, as I have done here, that somehow well-being and performance are in conflict with each other. In other words, if you improve the well-being of your workforce, there'll be a compensating hit in terms of their performance, and it will go down. And it's a misconception. It's about the idea that improving well-being is about going easy on people. Now, as you've seen from what I've said about demand and sense of achievement, etc., improving well-being is not about going easy on people. But there is in the back of the minds of many people, they'll say, you know, do you care about the well-being of your workforce? Yes, of course. The psychological well-being? Yes, of course I do. But when it comes to actually the judgment of making a decision that might have a short-term impact on performance and improve well-being, that's when their commitment starts to fall away and they're not so prepared to do it. Thank you.